Okay, welcome back. My name is Zach with my brother JP. We're back with another episode of the What Do We Know podcast. There's a few different items we wanted to talk about this week, but I thought we might lead it off by connecting to last week a little bit. We had sort of this open question. You had posed this question to me when we were talking about index funds, about sort of what happens to your voting power if you invest in an index fund, and centralizing all that money with an institution like Vanguard or Fidelity, and they're buying shares of companies. Who gets to decide? Who gets to administer that voting power? And I didn't know. And actually, I think you ended up being correct, whether you knew it or not, that it sort of does lie with the institutions. At least from what I found. And so, I guess there is a potential worry there. I did a little bit of research on the topic, and it seems like the default for most of these index fund providers is they do have some amount of voting power, but they seem to generally just defer to whatever the board is recommending from those individual companies. They don't seem to try to wield that power to, I guess, affect anything drastically. That doesn't mean that couldn't happen, so I think it is possibly a concern. But another thing that I stumbled into regarding this is there seems to be some amount of effort to try to return that power to the individual shareholders in some way, maybe innovation in that space. But I'm not sure. But it's definitely an issue of some amount of size, because we're talking about a lot of money being funneled through these things, and giving small single digit number of companies potentially immense control over other companies. So I don't know, kind of a weird situation, actually.
Yeah, I feel like the spirit of it would be, since people buy it as like a passive approach to investing, that those companies, like, it would make sense for them to be passive as well, and just kind of defer to the board or to like other shareholders, like active investors, or people that are like actively taking an interest in the company. But I forgot to look into it, so I don't know anything more than I did last week. But it seems maybe some innovation would be good, but I don't know. I mean, you buy S&P 500 ETF. Are you really going to, like, as like a shareholder buying that ETF? Are you going to know something about each of those 500 companies? And some of which you
Yeah.
may have, I mean, depending on your holdings, maybe you only have a few dollars or something worth. And so would it make sense to have a shareholder vote? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's sort of strange. I do think, to me, it's another area where, like, I guess competition in the free market is sort of good. So, for instance, you have Fidelity as a provider, Vanguard's a provider, Charles Schwab, BlackRock. These are big companies you can invest with, but those are all independent companies from each other. So they all have their own sort of index fund. And so even if passive investments generally have a lot of money in them, they could be spread out across any number of different providers, which sort of decentralizes some of the power. So I think that's a good thing. And then also, Vanguard is a really interesting company, one of the biggest index fund providers, who I have my accounts with largely. And they're a unique structure because the company is owned by its investors, essentially, and you're the investor. So if you open an account with Vanguard and you put some money in there to buy some stock or buy whatever, you actually become a part owner of Vanguard. So there's not, it's not like that company has to answer to its own shareholders, because it's you are the shareholder. just by having an account
Interesting.
with them. So you compare that to like a Fidelity, which I'm also a big fan of Fidelity. Fidelity's kind of the more traditional for-profit investment bank type of thing. So yeah, I think competition is good in that space. And then who knows? I mean, who knows what the future will bring in terms of innovation? But also the thing that I had thought last week was that there was something that Vanguard had sent me about ownership, and it turns out it was not related to the index fund. It was exactly what I just said. Because you're an owner, part owner of Vanguard, you get to vote on what happens at Vanguard, basically. So
Interesting.
it's a weird dynamic because you can become a part owner of a company by buying stock, but you sort of become a part owner of Vanguard not by buying stock, but by opening an account and being. It's sort of like being owned by its employees in a way,
Huh.
uh, which I like because it's there. It's sort of, I don't know. It feels good that there's incentive. It feels like there's some amount more incentive to kind of work for the shareholders, work for the employees, as opposed to just extract money from you in the name of profit, I guess. But there's a lot of good companies operating in this space, and we'll see. Now, though, I did find one exception in doing this research, which was apparently, I'm not sure which company it was. One of these providers did go against the board recommendation specifically for Exxon
Hmm.
because they were trying to impose, trying to shift the paradigm in some way towards renewables. There was some vote about something, and I guess the index fund, whoever made the decision, possibly some kind of group decision, decided, hey, we're going to actually try to affect change at this company as opposed to just going with the board. That seemed to be the only exception I could, at least high profile exception I could really find. And that was in the past year or two. Um, so I don't know. It's a really weird situation, I guess. Um, but I'm not sure what it would take for that to become a big problem. But I can definitely see how it could be abused over time, or if they got large enough.
Yeah.
It's sort of strange.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Like open an account and you become part owner. It kind of reminds me of. I think I remember like reading something from Noam Chomsky about it. Like the idea of workers owning part of the like having an ownership stake in the uh, company that they're working in.
Hmm.
And I think it was like in that context, it was kind of on the extreme side where like workers have total ownership of the company and there's like no other interests beyond that.
Right.
Um, but it does seem like that's becoming a more common thing, getting awarded stock grants as part of your compensation, or the opportunity to buy company stock at a slight discount or something like that. To
Some
kind of like,
incentive to, yeah.
yeah, it's, I mean, even if it's a small amount, like it's nice that when the company does well, then, the workers are doing well as well. Kind of aligns interests to some
Yeah.
extent.
I think it's a great thing to offer those kind of benefits to employees. The last company I worked for had something similar. You could basically buy discounted stock, and they would give you some amount of extra or whatever. I think it's great to have that, but realistically, like at least at that company, the most advantageous thing to do was get the stock as soon as you can, sell it as soon as you can, because there's an argument to be made that tying up some significant amount of your invested assets in the same company that you work with actually like
Yeah, right.
greatly increases your risk. Kind of like the put your eggs in all your eggs in one basket approach. So
Right.
if the
Yeah.
company starts doing bad, maybe your stock goes down, and then because the company's doing bad, you're more at risk of being laid off. And so then it's like a double whammy, right? Like you lose your job and you lose some significant amount of your holdings. Um,
That's interesting. So then it's like, if you want to promote employee ownership and then employees actually have an interest in minimizing their ownership because they're also working at the same
it's a
place.
weird dynamic, yeah.
Yeah.
So like our dad, had a bunch of stock options tied up in the airline,
Yeah.
right? And then the airline went bankrupt, essentially, U.S. Air anyway, and you kind of get hit doubly. He didn't end up losing his job, but a lot of pilots did.
Right.
So it kind of increases your risk um, awkwardly. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I like the idea. I like the idea of sort of having skin in the game, like you care about what the company does, and you kind of get rewarded when the company does well. Um, I think it's one avenue to provide extra compensation to employees, but there's also like profit sharing type of stuff. Is I don't know if it's better or worse, but like I personally don't want to have a bunch of my net worth or invested assets tied up in the company that I work for. Um, you can imagine in the extreme cases, like imagine the guys at Enron, right? Like they have maybe some amount of stock options and they're highly incentivized to invest in the company. And if you're not one of those top guys, not only do you lose your job, but the company like literally scammed you, was like a scam more or less, and
Oh,
you lose all your money, you know?
yeah.
So I don't know. It's a weird dynamic.
So, do you ever see yourself like taking on risk to a degree where you put a significant amount of your net worth in like a startup that you create? Like, do you think you'd ever take the entrepreneur route and like put a lot of skin in the game to do that?
I don't know if I would, just based on what I know about my risk tolerance and my risk profile. Possibly, possibly. I certainly appreciate people who do that, and like I've mentioned before, I want them to have every opportunity to try to be successful. I think it is a little bit different when in that kind of situation where like you're either starting up from scratch or it's kind of your endeavor. Um, and there's an argument to be made that if you're going to bet on something, you might as well bet on yourself. Like see if you can do it. I think it puts more uh, weight on your shoulders individually to be successful, as opposed to some multinational company and you have some amount of stock, maybe a lot of stock, maybe a lot of your net worth, but like it's not really all about you,
Right. Yeah.
Like you're in some ways you can't really control what happens. Like maybe you do really good at your job and you're getting promoted and you're helping your department and that's leading to some extra amount of profit in some small way to the company, but it doesn't really move the needle. Uh, unless you're like some big time executive making big decisions and you make some acquisition or something that turns out to be immensely profitable. I'm not sure how much the average employee is realistically affecting the bottom line. And I think most employees in most companies are very replaceable. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
just the reality.
For,
Even
for better or worse.
myself included. Like there's nothing magical that I do about the code that I write. It's just you know there's plenty of people who can do that job, even though it's in demand. So I don't know. I don't know if I would ever take on something like that. Maybe in the future. Who knows? But it's a very risky thing to try to start a company, and it's a very difficult thing to do, and you have to put in a lot of time and effort, and there's no guarantee of success. In fact, the odds are sort of stacked against you. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's also like you have to, yeah, because you have the likeliest side when you do a startup is that it's going to fail. So
yeah,
you have to figure out how to be able to fail and still keep going. So
right,
it might be like startup number 5 that actually, you know,
right.
makes it based on what you learned from your prior, iterations. But I kind of think I'm the same way. Well, actually, I know I'm the same way. I would never like I I feel much more like safe when I have like a cushion, a financial cushion.
Mm,
So I would never risk all that, like in a in any sort of like single point of failure,
right.
in a business or whatever. But it would be really cool someday once I have it, a sufficient nest egg or whatever to maybe do entrepreneurship and and have that flexibility to take on risk, but it's risk that's like non-essential, like if I already have the essentials covered.
Sure, sure. Yeah,
But
like a passion project or something, and once you kind of have your financial footing, be able to go off in another direction.
Yeah. Yeah. But also like, and just the challenge of it, because I'm so focused on like writing code and solving a specific problem set that like the larger view, I don't necessarily think about much. And then sometimes, like when the companies I've worked for, they I think part of like good leadership is communicating that down so people know why they're doing what they're doing, and why they're being asked to do what things that they're doing.
Sure.
um but I just like it almost just doesn't really even like I understand it, but it just doesn't stick. Like I don't really uh I don't really, I'm not really drawn at this point to like uh business type metrics. I'm just
Right.
more focused on like technical implementation and figuring out how to make systems work.
Which makes
So
sense, right? Because that's your job. I mean, you're
yeah,
being
yeah,
that's what you're being hired to do.
right, right. So, and I think part of it's just because I'm so focused on that that's where I spend all my time, my energy. So the other stuff just it doesn't matter as much day to day. But it would be cool to eventually take on those types of problem sets, um, you know, down the line, and be able to do so safely. Like it'd be
Mm,
cool to start a company. Be a ton of work and a lot of stress, I'm sure, but it'd be a fun challenge, I think.
yeah, it's definitely a risky endeavor. So the industry that I work in is sort of around small business loans, and getting capital to these business owners. And there's a whole like some of our so our clients are basically these lending institutions that give out money, and some of them, their policies are like just straight up, we don't lend to startups. Like
Huh.
we're not going to give somebody a loan who's a startup business because it's too risky for us. We don't want to take on that amount of risk for whatever reason. But yeah, it's a whole different ballgame in a sense. When at least when you're trying to secure capital for your business,
Yeah.
one of many factors. But yeah, like I said, I mean, I love that there are people out there who want to do that and who maybe are putting their eggs in those baskets on a routine basis and trying to make it work, because I think it's good. I think it's good for society. It's good for the economy. Um, and I mean, I enjoy my job from the technical side, but like I also connect with it um, functionally. Like there's some amount of I'm like I feel good in a way that like the company is trying to help small businesses. Like I feel like
Sure.
because I feel like
Yeah.
that's a good thing for society and for the economy, and so there's that side of it. Um, yeah, I don't know. There's a story that's coming to mind, which is I'm not sure if it's like an urban legend or I think there's probably some amount of truth to it, but um, the guy who founded FedEx, forget his name, but there was some point early on in the company's history where like he couldn't make payroll,
Hmm.
and the company was he was like basically on the brink of going under, losing the company, and he had some small amount of money left. And the story goes that he like flew to Vegas and gambled and ended up, I don't know, playing something, craps or roulette or something, and he ended up turning his like 5 grand into 20 grand or something, and he was able to make payroll that month.
Oh wow.
and and then the company was able to continue and then became successful. I don't know how much
Yeah.
how I don't know if that's true or how much of it is true, but it's I mean it's kind of a funny thing to consider.
Yeah. Like flying by the seat of your pants
Yeah,
mentality, which,
fast and
well,
loose, right?
when it works, you have great stories. It all
Yeah,
works out, but
yeah,
it seems like it's really risky too. But and maybe this kind of segues into another topic we had up. But I think it's really good to have that sort of entrepreneurial mindset, like that idea of ownership, even if you're not in an entrepreneurial role and you're at a big company or whatever. But that idea of like ownership of like taking responsibility for what your area of duty, like what
right.
you're tasked with, or what has been assigned to you, and like
Hmm.
not only completing it, but figuring out, like, when obstacles arise, figuring out how to surmount them, or find ways to continually improve. You know, find ways to be more efficient or productive, or to beat the competition. But sometimes it requires going the extra mile, and spending more time, or working harder, um, or having difficult conversations, and yeah, just finding people that are willing to do that. um, Obviously, if you're like a small business and you're the you're the owner, then it is falling to you. But
Hmm.
if you're in a larger company and you're just a minion, like,
Right.
still having that mindset, and still excelling at the work that you're tasked with, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be hard too, right? Because if you work for some big corporate company, in some way there's like incentive to not take ownership. It's almost better for you, some like career wise, to just play the game, try to climb the ladder. You can deflect blame, you can whatever it is. Um, it's sort of perversely incentivized to almost like backstab others, right? And just do as little as possible, and be political, which I think is detrimental to the long term effects, both for the company but also for you as an individual.
Right.
There's like a character thing going on there. Um, yeah, it's a good topic. So I mean, this gets into what our first real topic was scheduled for today, which is about Jocko Willink, and he has a book called Extreme Ownership. So Jocko is a retired Navy SEAL. I know he lives in San Diego, and that's kind of how I first heard about him when I was out
Hmm.
there. He started a podcast, the Jocko podcast, once he retired from the military, and he wrote this book. I think it's a book. I think it started as a business venture, like a post military business venture with another guy. This idea of extreme ownership, and they started doing like corporate events, and talking to teams, and obviously coming off of a SEAL team. I think there's a lot of crossover between how a SEAL team works, and certainly how leadership works, and in kind of crossing over into the corporate world. And I think that's kind of their launching off point. But yeah, there's this idea of extreme ownership, which is basically what you said, and this idea of it's kind of all on you. Like, don't shift the blame. It's kind of like the way I interpret his message about extreme ownership is more like, how much can you possibly take on? Like, from what you're, how far can you extend your responsibility? And that crosses over into the leadership realm. So if somebody that you're managing starts having problems or is not being successful in their job, I think the extreme ownership approach would say, that's a reflection of you as a manager, regardless of who they are, how well they're doing their job. Extreme ownership is about taking ownership of your responsibility in that dynamic, and taking ownership for how productive they're being, or what kind of employee they're being, as opposed to simply trying to shift the problem to them and say, well, you're just a bad employee. So it kind of puts the focus on you as an individual, trying to empower you. What can you do to improve your situation, both maybe personally but also professionally? Um, yeah, and it's a really interesting concept. I think it is somewhat missing in a lot of modern day commentary, because there's a big push to kind of like want to play the victim card. Like, it's not my fault that
Yeah.
something is going wrong, or that we're not successful, or I'm being victimized by somebody else. Not to take away from situations where that is a legitimate problem, but I think extreme ownership is about trying to start from a place where that's not what's going on. Really interesting stuff from Jocko. He's a guy I look up to a lot. I've watched a ton of his videos and podcasts. Uh, he has a lot of cool things to say.
Yeah, and that's really cool. It sounds like you might even got into them before me. I've been kind of reading his books and listening to his podcasts and whatnot for a couple years now. But if you're like following him back when you're in San Diego, I think that predates how long I have. But just the fact that we both kind of uh, have been following him for a while and didn't even know it until was it
Yeah.
last week when I suggested him as a topic and extreme ownership as a topic. But yeah, I've got a lot of value and I guess useful influence
Mm.
from his work and like extreme ownership, the topic and the book itself. Um, and just to quickly go through, I believe these are the five principles of extreme ownership that are described in his book, and it's cover and move. So like when you're uh, faced with a situation, like you're dealing with the immediate things, like you're covering the immediate things, but you're also moving, so you're like continuing to progress and moving on to the next thing or plotting a path forward. And in from where this came from, the SEAL teams, cover and move is like you're taking cover from live fire and then you're moving to safer or moving to where you need to go to execute the mission. Prioritize and execute is the next principle, and so
Mm.
that one is you're faced with a number of tasks or rapidly changing situation. There's different needs, different things that need to be addressed, and so you have to figure out which ones of those need to happen in what order, and then you need to go about like making them happen. The third one is simplify, so keep things simple. Plans should be simple as possible. Everyone should be able to have a clear understanding of what a plan is. If there's no need for excessive complexity, then strip it out and just keep things as simple as possible. That to still deliver on the mission. Decentralized command, which is something I
Mm.
think about a lot in a I mean, in this context, with combat and, you want your teams to be able to make decisions semi-autonomously to make sure that, they can adapt to changing situations and still execute the mission. But, decentralized command, also from the perspective of like, uh, of so, social organization, like,
Mm.
in society.
Yeah.
Even down to the individual level, which I think, in the West, we're kind of more individualistic, but that idea of just sort of like taking responsibility and making decisions and doing the right thing from the individual and then, all the way up to larger groups or society as a whole. But yeah, decentralized command will allow systems, I think often, or maybe most of the time, in most cases, systems will be more uh, flexible and resilient when you have decentralized command.
Mm.
And then the last one is default aggressive, which is like, continuing to push forward and to, yeah, just keep making effort to achieve whatever the goal is. And then, of course, is like, I guess this is motto, which is discipline equals freedom. I think that's
Yeah.
an important concept as well. And I mean, maybe at first glance, kind of like paradoxical because you don't think of like discipline as being, you know, as being free, but the
Right.
idea is that you need to have discipline or that like self control, focus, drive to set goals and to work towards them and achieve them in order to be free. So, uh, you know, it's sort of like being able to, I wouldn't say control, but maybe favorably influence your circumstances. So then you have more options,
Mm.
going forward.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are the big things I got from like that book, Extreme Ownership, and then Jocko, his sort of teachings in general.
Yeah. It's interesting because so I haven't read the book.
Oh,
I don't read, and this sounds terrible. I don't read that many books. I sort of prefer to consume content in like an audio form. I
Oh,
think
actually,
that's
that's how I. It was an audiobook. So
oh
when I
really
say read, I actually listened. Yeah.
gotcha. Um, yeah, it's interesting to hear those like the breakdown of those points. Um, I guess when I've heard Jocko talk about extreme ownership, I guess I probably come to that understanding more of like from a higher level approach, I guess, as opposed to actually looking at the points that he's talking about. But it makes sense. It's interesting to consider some of those sub points. The decentralized one is really interesting to me, especially I guess as I often do. My mind goes to computer systems and sort of decentralizing control can be a really important concept, and it make you can if you execute on that kind of design, you can build more resilient programs because if things aren't dependent on each other as much, then when one thing fails, other things aren't necessarily affected.
Right.
Um, so yeah, and I think it probably has a lot of different applications across both from a military context, but also into the sort of business and corporate world. Um, I know that I sort of feel best at work. I tell this to my boss all the time. We're very open about this. When I don't want people breathing down my neck. I don't want some manager micromanaging my time. Being concerned about what I'm doing with every minute of my day. One of the past companies I worked for was like a big contracting company, and you had to schedule your time
Hmm.
down to I think it was like in 7 minute increments. Like
Oh wow.
every 7 minutes needed to be accounted for in some way. Just like and like there's some amount of that where it makes sense when you're like a consulting company and you have to bill a client and you need to come up with time billed, but man, does it make for a frustrating experience as an employee. I feel much better when, oh, my dog is up and next to me and wants to go for a walk. I'll just get up and take him for a walk. I don't need to ask permission from anybody. I'm sort of empowered to be able to make that decision. Um, but yeah, I guess that's kind of how I think about decentralized command. Um, but also the other thing you said, discipline equals freedom. Another sort of core Jocko principle, I would say. Is that specifically in the book?
Yeah, I believe so.
It is.
I'm like 90% sure,
Okay, interesting.
95% sure.
Yeah, that's one of those. And Jocko is very much to me. I think I talked about this a little last week about like ideas that I discuss on this podcast are almost aspirational at times.
Right. Yeah.
Like I look up to Jocko a lot, and a lot of his ideas really resonate with me. But like he is the guy who gets up at 4 a.m. to go to the gym. Like
Yeah.
that's like his daily thing. And like I'm the guy who gets up at like 10:30 and starts work. Because I hate getting up in the morning. And so like discipline equals freedom that resonates with me. But man, is that hard for me to implement.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's true. So I mean, if you can, the times in my life where I reflect back and think that I've been the most successful, whether it be from like personal productivity point of view or like career wise, or I guess however metric you want to define it, mood, outlook or happiness or whatever. I feel like it's times that corresponds with me being disciplined. Um, and there's almost always like a physical activity component to that as well, whether I'm actually in like a successful gym routine or some kind of other exercise program. There's definitely a physical component, which I think is something Jocko talks about. And if you can kind of wrap your head around being disciplined in that way, it does sort of open up other areas of your life. You don't have to feel guilty about, you know, whatever, like having that ice cream or whatever, because you know that you've been going to the gym, and so you feel more free to be able to make that decision. Whereas it's really, really easy, especially for me, to sort of fall into these ruts where you kind of just say, well, screw it. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. I'm just going to do whatever. And that becomes like a self fulfilling prophecy. And then you make decisions that are more destructive to yourself. And you actually end up in a position where, like, by making these decisions because you're free to do whatever you want, right? You're an adult, who cares? You actually end up in in a spot where like you don't feel free at all. You feel like very
Right.
trapped, like you feel like you're ruining your life and it's hard to get out of it, and um, you're certainly not exercising any amount of discipline, at least for me. So those are hard places to be. It's like a hard truth to swallow in a way, um, about trying to be disciplined, but it can certainly pay dividends in a big way.
Yeah, 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 I mean, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but it makes sense for me at least, like when I reflect on it. So like, you want to be healthy, have lots of energy, then that requires expending energy, like getting
Mm.
exercise, uh, making time for sleep, eating well, all that stuff. Um, and you want to be like mentally sharp. Well, you got to engage your mind, and you got to think about things and consume like quality information, like be open to learning, debate or engage with ideas. So yeah, I mean, sure, like I think really in any aspect in life, like there's not really a free lunch, even if it kind of seems like there is at
Yeah,
first. And it's really like you'll get what out of it what you put into it, which took me a long time to realize.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, why is that though? Why is that, and why is that so hard? Why do we as human beings, like, I can hear that truth and understand it and conceptualize it and wrap my brain around it, and then maybe tomorrow might come and I'll make the same mistake. Like, what is it about either the human experience or us as individuals? You think, like, why does that have to be something that's so difficult?
Yeah, I don't know, like willpower, right? Um, yeah, maybe. I mean, this is just spitballing, but maybe there's some like evolutionary trait where it was advantageous to not expend more energy than necessary.
Mm,
So, like a tendency to be lazy or to conserve energy. Of course, that doesn't always, has a lot of problems. It doesn't always bring advantages, but maybe there's some kind of like, like evolutionary underpinning for laziness, because it
mm,
seems to be like a tendency that everyone has, and you have to kind of fight against it.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, there's a an old maxim in programming as well about the best programmers are lazy programmers, right? So like, because if you see something you have to do repeatedly, it's actually easier, might be easier in the long term to automate it and make your life easier in some way, which is
yeah,
great. It's great for like technology, but then it sort of like enables you to be lazy in a way.
yeah,
Um,
but it's also like I feel like there's a thread there with productivity. So as you're automating away those, mindless, repetitive tasks, then you free up time and energy to take on new challenges
mm,
that maybe eventually can be automated away too. And
mm,
then so you just keep like ratcheting up to higher and higher uh, levels of um, I don't challenges or like leverage. Like you can just use your time more productively, and
yeah,
that's probably true with like even working out. You keep leveling up. You're getting stronger and faster, and you're expending energy, but you're producing more results. I don't know. I feel like there's probably some commonalities across domains with that sort of thing.
yeah. I think that's true. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's I think it also sort of ties back into a lot of general themes about life, like how do you live a meaningful life, and um, I like one thing that I this idea that I come back to is that like you sort of need something to strive for, like
Yeah.
Miley Cyrus said it. It's not how it's not about what's on the other side of the mountain, right? It's the climb. It's
Yeah.
it's the journey. These are things that are sort of like encoded into us that we know, but like we forget. It seems. Um, That's why I think I've mentioned this before, but like there's this idea in the early retirement space that you need something to retire to, not retire away. Like you're not retiring away from work to just like sit around. You need something to do with your time. Human beings want to be productive. Like there's something about us that needs that fulfillment in some way. Uh, like challenges to overcome. Um, so I don't know. It's something that I am constantly fighting against because it's very hard for me to be motivated sometimes to do things. But I do feel better at the end of the day when I've been productive and I've done things, even though in the moment I'm not necessarily enjoying it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very weird, I guess, part of the human condition. Uh, Something sort of intangible in a way. There's so another guy that maybe we'll get into sometime is psychology professor. His name's Jordan Peterson.
Oh,
Heard of
sure.
him?
Yeah.
Kind of some crossover with Jocko. Somewhat of a controversial figure, though I don't think most of his ideas are controversial necessarily. But anyway, he has this. I remember him giving an interview sometime and saying like what are you going to do? You're going to retire and then your plan is just you're just going to drink margaritas on the beach every day? It's like, hey, sounds great, but like how long can you do that? A month? Like maybe 6 months? Can you do that for 3 years? Can you do that for the rest of your life? Like can 20 years go by and that's your only experience in life? Like you just can't do that.
Right.
You need something more eventually. Um, Otherwise, now you don't need to, but like you can sort of be driven to insanity in a way, like you have no purpose. There's nothing to make you get out of bed. So I think about that stuff a lot because I am very often in that space where like I don't want to get out of bed, like
Yeah.
um, I don't know how to motivate necessarily, but and I think that's the difference is there's this difference between motivation and discipline, right? Which is sort of what Jocko's talking about. Discipline is sort of, well, I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do it because I have this, I've built this discipline muscle, that I do things, I complete things, I see things through. Um, there's certainly a lot of themes there throughout life and career wise and really anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we had talked about the idea of flow and flow states. And there's a
Yeah,
book called Flow. I think we referenced that like maybe in our first podcast. But um yeah, just having a goal and working towards it, and like that deep focus and the meaning that it brings. And then when importantly, like when you reach that goal, then you set another goal, like maybe you're increasing the complexity. It's a more audacious goal in some way.
mm,
And so then you've grown from working on the first goal, but now you've ratcheted up the complexity, so you once again get in that deep focus state, and you're working on that next goal. And so it's just kind of like a continual process.
right.
um, and obviously, like, you can't do it all the time. Like, those deep flow states take a lot of energy and and discipline, I guess. So you have to have a balance. Like, you gotta have time to rest and recuperate and everything. But
Hmm.
um, it definitely is a big part of meaning. And I think in that book, they're arguing there's evidence that is also what underpins happiness to some degree, is
Right.
like that meaning, and like, the benefits that you get from having those sort of flow states.
Yeah, happiness ends up sort of being a byproduct.
Yeah.
Like
And
happiness isn't the goal in itself; it just happens by living a meaningful life, sort of.
right. Yeah. And also interestingly in that book is the argument that like drugs and, yeah, I guess really drugs, uh, uh, as way people use those as ways to seek happiness, and maybe it brings like temporary, bliss, or the feeling of happiness or whatever. But it also, those in part, they're doing that by decreasing your like your capacity. to work or to think or to whatever it is, and then so you're entering in flow states uh, in order to solve like problems that shouldn't require that much focus or concentration. So it's like you're like
Interesting.
you're able to shoot for lower goals, but still like find meaning in them because you've also decreased your capacity to work
Like
towards those goals.
intentionally stunting your potential, sort of.
Yeah, which is yeah, interesting concept.
That's
Like,
I've never heard it put like that. That's really cool.
yeah. Yeah, it's a good book. It's a bit of a long read, and I think it's kind of repetitive and whatnot, but it's definitely it's definitely I found it really interesting to go through.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to get it on audiobook or something. The other place my brain is going is, I mean, I'm very into different video games, as you know, playing some with our younger brother as well, quite often. And just in the video game world, I think one of the reasons that it sort of resonates with me is because it provides an avenue for that experience. Possibly even like with the drug um, metaphor there, like it's lowering the bar to enable you to have that experience. But anyway, my point was it's almost exclusively about the journey, at least in that context.
Yeah.
And the times when I've been doing some very difficult thing in a video game, or like striving for something over literally weeks or months, like trying to work towards a goal, and then sort of attaining the goal is kind of like almost a letdown, right? Because it's not really about attaining the goal. It's about trying to get there. Like that's the fun part, you know. That's the
Yep.
part that gets you excited about doing it. And there's been plenty of examples in different games over the years that I played where like you literally reach the goal and like turn it off, like never turn it back on. Like you get
Huh.
there and it's like I'm like there's not no other reason for me to do this, you know? Like I'm done with it. Like it's not exciting anymore. And kind of to your point about like it's sort of like on to the next challenge, you know, like what's the next one, what's the next thing that I can test myself or struggle against. um, so I don't know, it's definitely something that is part of the human condition, and you know you need to struggle, you need to strive, and you know whether that be personally or professionally or both or whatever it is, it feels like a very important part of being a human being. It's
Yeah.
finding a way to engage with that idea of trying to overcome, right? To work towards that goal.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that you can kind of, to a degree, engineer those like engineer the circumstances that can be conducive to flow states. So like games are really good with that, and part of that is there needs to be a timely element of feedback. Like
Mm,
you have to be able to make an attempt, whatever it is, and then in a fairly short period, like get some feedback for whether that worked or whether it didn't, and then you can kind of modify and try again, and kind of keep iterating. Um, and so yeah, like if you're trying to if you have a goal, breaking up into steps where you can get more immediate feedback to like as you're working towards each of those steps.
mm.
Um, and I think like this is another book. I think it's called Hooked. I haven't read it yet, but it's kind of been on my list for a while. And it's actually diving into what makes some apps addictive, like how to get
Mm.
people hooked to using a particular app. I
Gotcha.
think it like again, I haven't read it, but I think from what I've looked, what I understand is that in part it's kind of using those same approaches so that you're giving people feedback. You're probably in the context like tugging on emotions and whatnot too, but you're like keeping their focus and like kind of
Little dopamine hits along the way.
yeah, and kind of like facilitating that flow state that feels good to be in. So
That's interesting because I mean, I'm not really a big user of social media and apps and stuff like that. A little bit, but I, I can. It's almost like for me, maybe you get in the flow state, but then like afterwards, looking back, it's almost like sort of like a getting off of a drug, right? It's almost
Yeah.
like you kind of have like a hangover. Like you don't necessarily feel good about it. You're like yeah, it was cool at the time, and I was getting dopamine hits here and there, and like they were reinforcing that for me. But looking back objectively, it's like probably not a good use of time. Like I'm not really taking anything away from that compared to maybe like being in some cool programming project or building a woodshed or something, and you're just feeling good and you're going, and then afterwards you like kind of feel productive, like I did something. But I wonder if there's different sort of like different kinds of flow states, as I've definitely felt that dichotomy before, and like something that's kind of dragging me along, keeping my interest, but then I end up coming out the other side and being like not really worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I was just kind of thinking the same thing. And maybe there's like different types of flow states, or maybe it's just what you're working towards, like the goals that you're choosing,
Yeah,
and that you're striving for as you get into those flow states. So,
it's definitely strange, and yeah. So there's this idea of happiness is sort of it's really nebulous and fleeting to me. Um, and I spend a lot of time thinking about happiness and talking to my therapist about happiness. Like how do you be happy? And actually, I get kind of frustrated sometimes because depending on what you're doing or what you're reading or who you're talking to, sometimes the answer is, well, it's just like a light switch, basically, like or like choose to be happy.
hmm,
And like it's so easy to just turn the light switch on. But that's never been my experience. It's certainly never been easy, nor does it feel like a switch that you can actuate in some way. But like I said before, I sort of resonate more with it's like a byproduct. Um, and
yeah,
so by choosing to focus on other things, um, you end up sort of producing happiness accidentally. And one of those is by doing things that are meaningful or striving towards goals or whatever. And just as a quick anecdote, so just yesterday was Saturday. We were doing sort of house projects and chores and stuff, and we rented a rug cleaner, and my
hmm,
wife was cleaning the house and stuff, and I was doing stuff outside, and I have a fish tank and a stand that I had built for it. And I had been meaning to like wrap this like trim around it, sort of like decorate it a little more, make it look nicer. And once I started going, I started really getting into it, and like
hmm,
I didn't want to leave that state even to eat. Like it was a really involved project, and I was measuring and cutting and screwing these pieces together, and it's something where like on any given day looking at this, I'd be like, oh, I need to do this, but I really don't feel like it. I don't want to. It's gonna take so long or whatever. But then, if maybe to kind of Jocko's point, like if you can have that discipline to get going, to just literally get from like 0 to 1, like start. Uh, there's something about maybe that feedback loop, even like you start to do one thing and then you're just like, oh, I can start to like visualize what this is going to look like, or I feel good about having completed a step. And then like at least for me it becomes hard to stop.
right.
I end up having the opposite problem of like I don't want to step away from this. um, but so I went through that whole process and was spending my whole day doing stuff like that, and at the end of the day, like I felt good, like feel productive. I feel like I did something meaningful, something that worked to make our surroundings better in some way, and feel happy about that. But if I were to wake up that morning and be like, what can I do to make myself happy today? It would be a very different answer.
Yeah.
Like, let's go get a pizza and some beers and ice cream and I don't know, like sit on the couch, watch TV or something.
Yeah.
Um, but then that would end up, not only would I have not got that stuff done, and I would have, probably negatively impacted my health by making those decisions to eat all this unhealthy food or whatever. But then at the end of the day, I wouldn't have even attained the thing that I was shooting for anyway, which was to be happy. So like, I don't
Yeah.
feel like at least me, I don't feel like I have the capacity to make decisions to make myself happy. I have to go from the other side. I have to make decisions to be productive and accomplish something, and then happiness will come from that. It's a
Yeah.
very strange feeling.
Except now it sounds like you're aware of it. So now you do have the capacity to make yourself happy because you just know what to focus on.
Well, you'd think that, and maybe that's where mental health comes in. But like, I understand that. I can reason about that. I can logically understand those decisions, but that doesn't make it any easier to get off the couch. When
Yeah.
I'm drinking coffee, like, oh, I'm gonna go put some work clothes on and go, cut some boards for the next 4 hours. Like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, that's always a tough part, right? Like getting started on something. And for me especially, it's when I know that something is going to become involved, then I have more of a tendency to want to put it off.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, this is a great point that Jordan Peterson makes. Actually, his like one of his things that I think he's sort of known for is this idea of he calls it like clean your room,
Oh yeah.
right? So like, how do you get your life in order? Like, if your life is all messed up, and his advice basically is clean your room. And the point that he's essentially making is like, if you're in that state where you're sort of stuck, you can't get off the couch, like, just do something. Like, put some small part of your life in order. So literally, like your room, like make your bed, pick up your clothes, whatever it is, clean your room. And if you can do that, you sort of start to gain momentum. It's the same idea in finance, actually, about paying down debts. There's two different ways. There's called the snowball method or the avalanche method. The
Hmm.
avalanche method is literally just pay down your highest percent debt. It's like the mathematically most beneficial way. But the snowball method is thought to be more successful because its whole thing is find the smallest debt you have, regardless of interest rate. It's not, forget the math, and just pay it off. And by doing that, you gain some small win, right? And you build. It's about building momentum, like the snowball rolling down the hill. The same thing with like cleaning your room. There's something psychological about being human that if you can put two pieces together, like you feel good about yourself in some way, like you've done something. So I mean, it's hard. It's still hard. It's still hard to make that decision to get off the couch. But
Yeah.
um, so the times that I think I've had the most success is sort of related to that, where I try it. Like, let me, like, okay, I don't need to break out my ladder right now and like get on my roof and do like whatever, but just go do something, something small, like go take out the trash or something. And then you start getting those wins. You're like, oh, like now I actually feel like undertaking something, like it's a very weird experience.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, I can definitely relate. I've been there too. And I think I get into spaces less often, maybe even rarely now. And I attribute that to just momentum. I guess just, the snowball effect. Because I mean, like way back when, I could spend days in bed just sleeping. Like I didn't feel like getting up. I get up and, go use the restroom or something, or eat a little bit of food and go back to sleep. Um,
Yeah.
so I just didn't feel like doing anything. But now, like, I can't really lay in bed much beyond my usual time of waking up because I start getting antsy. Like I want to go do stuff. And I think it's just like I have a pretty established routine.
Mm.
There's still some flexibility in it. It's not like, super uh, rigid, but like I always have something like the next thing, like I know what I'm going to be working on, at least in general, next, like whether it's, having that morning cup of coffee, or, going and brushing my teeth, or, taking the dog for a walk, or, sitting down and getting to work, or whatever it is. There's all like I always know what is going to come next, like the next phase of the day. So and I built enough variety into it, I think, where I still like, obviously when I'm working, I'm concentrating and I get in those flow states. And then, I'm like out walking the dog or whatever, and like getting some exercise and, or, tidying up around the house. So like, or just spending time with the family,
Hmm.
getting that aspect in too. So I think it's like having engineered like a kind of well balanced for me routine, and it's sort of like we're talking about automating. Like I've kind of automated those like that foundation to an extent where I don't really have to think about it because it's just like just the it's built into my habits at this point.
Hmm.
So yeah, so then I'm freed up to like to be focusing on whatever it is that's I'm working on or working towards for each of those aspects, even if it's just like taking a walk and thinking about whatever current events I was reading about or ideas, or talking to wife or kids, or so yeah, I think there is something as far as I wouldn't say like controlling, but uh, maybe engineering is the best word, like kind of setting up your external circumstances to help like like push your internal state and maintain it to where you want it to be.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like it's even uh, what's Newton's whatever law, like an object at rest will stay at rest, an object in motion will stay in motion.
Yeah,
It's almost like literally applies to your life. Like
yeah,
if you're sitting around all day, you don't want to get up. You know,
yeah,
you're
yeah.
going to tend to stay at rest.
And it was something that like resonated, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever it was, when I kind of got into yoga heavily, is at that point still dealing with some depression, and it was a lot of like doctors and whatnot were pushing for antidepressants, and I tried that, limited effectiveness for me. um, or with yoga you have a disciplined routine, and you're going through your yoga sequence, and then like there's like a whole philosophy behind it, and like you're kind of reflecting on those points as well, and just kind of going about living in a more like kind of disciplined way. And that ultimately was like really effective in helping me to get through that place, and to kind of get on the road to building out this routine that I have now, where like I'm only actually doing like a yoga practice maybe once or twice a week at most.
Hmm.
So it's not really even so much about the yoga as it is just about the disciplined routine
Right.
more generally.
And that ends up making you sort of more resilient anyway. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so before we transition, I know we've sort of gone all over the place again, but there was this one other point about Jocko specifically that I wanted to bring up that is sort of related to this, which is there's a short video, it's 2 minutes long, that maybe we'll link in the description here, that we both watched beforehand from Jocko, and it's sort of a famous or maybe infamous um, part of his podcast at this point, and it's called Good, and it's a fantastic watch, I think, but the message is it's basically about being resilient, and it's almost like reframe, like how to reframe a situation. The point is basically that no matter what happens in life, his I think the point that he's making is he's talking when he's in a leadership position and he's talking to his subordinates and something bad happens and his answer literally is good. Like something bad has happened and he says good, like it's good that it has happened, because if you can sort of reframe the situation, no matter how terrible it is, to the point where like there's an opportunity there. Like you get fired from your job, it's like good. Like now I can focus on something else. I can transition careers that I was maybe thinking about, or I can focus on improving my skills and applying for jobs maybe try to increase the salary, whatever it is. Like there's some way to approach the situation, to try to find the positive. Um, and again, it's another one of those ideas from Jocko that I just absolutely love, but it can be so hard for me specifically to put that into practice. You know, there's a related concept called I think there's even a book maybe called Anti-Fragile, which is the idea is that you try to, well, I'll probably get the idea of the book wrong, but the concept is basically to try to strengthen yourself so that you're more resilient, so that no matter what somebody says about you or no matter what happens in your life, that you're stronger than you were the day before. You're growing. You're getting better. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier about something to strive for. Like you're always improving. So that video always resonates with me. It's almost motivational in a big way, and it's about just about trying to find the positive in life. So, what did you think about those points?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a hugely like critical and powerful message. And I don't know if the message itself is I'm I'm trying to find a funny way of saying this, but I love the like the jokes that message, like people are like it's like even in the YouTube comments they'll come up with like some crazy terrible scenario and they're like good. Yeah. Like I think one of them was like some guy loses his legs, good, now or loses his arms, good, now he can focus on leg day. Just like kind of like ridiculous exaggerations of it, but yeah, it kind of reminds me of like mom a while back had said like you can't control what happens to you, but you can control your response to it. So like kind of like taking that that like focus on and then from like a yoga perspective, like or meditation, like that present moment, and then like that's sort of like the point at which uh, you can make choices, right? You can choose to attach to whatever whatever thing that you're focusing on, or you can kind of like take a step back and just sort of like witness it and
Hmm.
or take it in a different direction. And I think it's kind of the same thing. I don't know if I have the right words for it, but it's sort of like having that it's not self-efficacy, but it is like a point of empowerment that you can choose how you respond to an adverse situation. And so you can choose to just look at it like good and look for the positive in it, or look how to make it into a positive experience, um, which is not easy to do a lot of times.
No,
you
it
know
can be hard to overcome adversity.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, and then like um so I work out a lot, and I try to I'm always trying to like get stronger, or do something faster, and I'm like terrible at it. Like I'm not that strong, I'm not that fast, and I don't think I have like a particularly high threshold for pain. So like when I start like lifting heavier than I'm used to, or like I don't know, like doing a lot of core work or something, and my muscles are starting to burn, I can only take it for so long, and then I have to like let back and relax for a little bit. And I think it's something I've been trying to work on, is like in that moment of like discomfort, like even pretty strong discomfort, just being able to kind of sit with it and keep pressing ahead, which
Hmm.
is tough, like even
Really
like
hard.
you know thinking through this sort of approach, and it's one thing to like to understand it, but another thing to like do it.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. It's really hard. Life is hard is really the takeaway.
Yeah.
um, yeah. Okay. Well, before we run away on 10 more tangents, why don't we try to go over the other some other topics that we've been trying to talk about for a few weeks. Um,
Yeah.
so one of the things that uh, we had sort of mentioned was maybe just to discuss the current situation between Russia and Ukraine. I think you had brought up that you wanted to talk a little bit about it. So do you want to maybe give us a frame of reference to talk about it, or is there a certain facet of what's going on you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, just it's been a really jarring experience. Maybe for better or worse, I'm a bit of a news junkie, so I like read through, the headlines and click through into some of them a little bit more depth. Or, as far as like not always spending the best use of time, I'll end up on Reddit and start going down subreddits for, in this case, like for the Ukraine stuff that's been happening. And it's just uh, one thing I try to do is try to understand the perspective of both sides, like all sides of an issue.
Hmm.
And I have a lot of trouble trying to understand Russia's motivations in it. Like, is it just, because like, okay, so they're saying it's denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, and that NATO, was to blame for pressing westward and, like beginning to build up arms on Russia's doorstep, basically. Um, and then, from like a geopolitical perspective, there's apparently a lot of energy in the eastern part of Ukraine, and then there's also warm water ports for that Russia like had some agreement where they could use those, even though they're Ukrainian ports. And Ukraine has kind of gone back on that in the past, I don't know, like within the past 5 or 10 years. And so, Russia has it feels pressure to want to to maintain access to those ports to, was it the Black Sea, and so
Into the
like,
Mediterranean, and yeah.
yeah, ultimately to the Mediterranean. So, and then I guess historically, Russia's been invaded a couple of times from Europe, like through Napoleon, and I'm sure, or obviously the Nazis,
Yeah.
through Ukraine. It's like a big like plateau. Like there's not like a lot of natural obstacles, so it's a very like hard area to defend through. So it kind of makes sense to want to have a buffer. Um, but then at the same time, like it just seems, they're invading Ukraine. It's really united Europe, like beyond anything that I can remember seeing, since I've been paying attention. Not that I've been around that long, but like now
Mm-hmm.
you have Finland and Sweden looking to join NATO, and like the NATO alliance is more unified and solidified than ever. Individual countries are stepping up and doing what I guess Trump never could, which is to get them to spend more than at least 2% of their budgets on defense and all
Mm.
that stuff. Um, so, so yeah, it seems like it was a real bad error on Russia's part, or miscalculation or whatever, to have invaded them. But then also like how they went about it, and they're basically just destroying areas of Ukraine and murdering people,
Yeah.
civilians included. Um, and it's like a scorched earth tactic. So yeah, I guess I don't really understand like the Russia side of it. The whole thing is just kind of appalling because not used to seeing, you know, a westernized country. Like it looks like Europe, it's basically, I mean, it is part of Europe, just being utterly destroyed like that.
Yeah.
It looks like something that you see on the History Channel. So
Yeah. It's almost like I think there's some amount of perception that in today's modern age, like it's not like we don't really have wars like that, like yeah, I mean what's been going on in the Middle East for the past 30 years, but like what you said, it sort of looks different. It's almost like psychologically like feels different because it's part of Europe being invaded literally. I don't know. It's very strange. I mean I can, to your point, trying to think through how Russia sees it. I think NATO is very scary from the Russian perspective because the NATO, I mean, that's literally an alliance that basically says, if you're a NATO country and you get attacked, like the full force of NATO comes to your defense, basically. I thought I read something that like the last time that that sort of I'm not sure what you would call it, like that sort of rallying cry that a NATO country sort of requested that kind of help was the 9/11 attacks. Maybe like
Yeah,
the
I
United
think so.
States was like, listen, we have been attacked. Like NATO was mobilizing. Like we're doing this, you know. And then the alliance basically says that okay, like you're part of this alliance, like you're in, like you're going. And so if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, that's obviously a big problem for Russia because that basically means that they are now facing the full brunt of what the NATO alliance brings to the table. Should they, want to deal with Ukraine in some way? I can definitely see how that makes them nervous. Very interesting that Sweden and Finland want to join because, I mean, that's Finland shares a border with Russia, right? I mean, they're right there.
Yeah.
So it's basically the same thing. And not that Ukraine is third world, but there's definitely a difference between sort of Eastern Europe of Ukraine and Czechoslovakia and stuff like that compared to Sweden, Finland, Denmark. The sort of Nordic countries are definitely maybe a little wealthier, have a little more power, something like that. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. I don't know what's going on. To me, it's I think it is interesting that not that not that the West never makes any mistakes. They obviously do, but it again sort of harkens back to the extreme importance of free speech and free media. There's there's no journalism outlet, at least in the West, really, that's being forced to report. Maybe there is one, but like in general, that's being forced to report the events in a specific way. It's sort of let's just figure it out and report it. Maybe there's some narrative in there, depending on what organization you are about what those events mean and how to interpret them. But I'm very curious to see like what is the message being sent internally to the Russians. How is their media framing these events? It's just obviously the same problem in North Korea and China. Any of these authoritarian governments where there's state-owned media and they control the narrative. So, for better or for worse, the United States makes many problems, but you at least have the media that they're at least free to report on things, right? Like they can say whatever they want. It's very scary. The the take that I've heard about this that makes the most sense to me is that first of all, it's an obvious problem that you have people in power like Putin or what's his name in China, Xi Jinping or whatever. That their terms just last forever, right? That's a huge problem. For all the problems that the United States has, again, you at least have a chance to change the president every 4 years. So even if you absolutely are appalled by Donald Trump or whoever else, there's an end date. Even if he gets reelected, like there's an end date. That's encoded into the system of government. Like China rewrote its government so that they never have to oust him, basically. Like Putin has been, I don't know how he continues to stay in power because I think they frame it that it's like a democratic process and he just keeps getting elected. But even if that's true, there's nothing there needs to be an end date ultimately where this stuff has to turn over. And it's very scary that it never does. So those are like huge red flags to me. But the take that I have seen that makes the most sense is that Putin specifically, maybe Russia at large, feels like they want to or need to restore some amount of the former glory of the former Soviet Union. And Ukraine is part of that. And they annexed Crimea whenever that was like 7 or 8 years ago. Literally annexed part of that country, and it definitely got news coverage, but ultimately, that sort of died down, and they got away with it. Basically, they like took that over. Like now it's theirs, and I think that's on the Black Sea as well. Like it's a strategic location.
Yeah.
So it's very scary when you have a huge military power like Russia on the global stage who has, I think they have more nuclear arms than any other country. Like, what are you going to do? Like, how do you combat that? And when you have authoritarian, sort of unstable government in place, I mean, it's very scary for all involved. Um, but if you're Putin and you can frame it that you are liberating people, you're liberating Eastern Ukraine from the tyranny of radical, you know, white supremacists or Nazis or whatever they were saying. I can see how that can be spun by their state-owned media companies to their people and be able to garner some support for it. So I don't know. It's very scary when you have people that have that kind of authoritarian control, which is why I can be very critical of policies in this country that I see as trying to bend the needle towards that authoritarian side, even if they're good intentioned or seemingly good intentioned. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm glad that we don't live in a country that has that kind of authoritarian power, at least not now. But I don't know what the solution is, and I don't know what the solution is for the United States specifically when there's pressure. We've even talked about this maybe in one of our episodes about what should we do? Like, is it worth it to intervene in some way? Are we expected to intervene? Um, we've been providing military supplies and aid and money and stuff like that, but what does it mean to get involved more directly? Is it worth it to put American lives at risk for this? I don't know. It kind of harkens back to me to like Vietnam, where you had, there was this idea that we have to stop the spread of communism, right? And we're going to go get involved on the other side of the world, something that basically doesn't have anything to do with us. And how many tens of thousands of Americans lost their lives, or ultimately a war where North Vietnam overtook South Vietnam anyway. And like, what is how many families were broken by that war and still feeling the effects today? Certainly, for what? For what? Because we're the protectors of peace at the on the world stage. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, but it's also, the other side of that coin is very difficult. Like, are you just going to sit by and let human rights abuse, happen, and all these innocent people be murdered by seemingly an unjust Russian invasion? Man, it's complicated. Uh, I don't know what the answer is, but it's just a complete mess over there, and it's a very scary time.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that kind of gets me is, besides obviously the human cost, is like the international order. It's based on, nonviolence, following international law. Like, nations have sovereignty, respect their borders. So if, I guess really Russia already has, with Crimea and Georgia, and there's another one. I'm blanking on where, but so like, in the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years, Putin's been in power. He's done this repeatedly where he just takes over land
Yeah,
of an adjacent country and has received very little pushback against it. So that, that's one perspective, is that's what in part has led to this miscalculation here, where he's kind of gone into Ukraine, is that he thought he could get away with it and he wouldn't receive much pushback from it. But I think that's one of the big costs, is if we like turn a blind eye and just let it happen, then it's just going to happen again. Whether he goes into Moldova or into the what is it, the Latvian countries? Is that the name for them? Estonia and whatnot, and
like the
Latvia.
Baltic states, or
Baltic states, yeah, yeah, yeah. Or we don't stand up for international order here, and then um, China decides they want to take Taiwan, and so they're going to
right?
kind of feel more free. Or who knows, what any other country is just like, oh, I want my neighbor's territory. Might makes right, so I'm just going to go in there and take it. So
And historically, that's how history is operated for the better part of human history.
yeah,
If you can
yeah,
take it, you can take it.
yeah. but now like we have a more interconnected world, and there's
Right.
like trade is relatively free across borders. So there's less, I think, less need really to like control territory directly, where you can just trade with them and just like everybody can cooperate and get along. Like there should be enough for everybody. But yeah, this Russia thing, I think about it a lot. Like, what would be uh, you know, the right response? Like, how best to deal with the situation? And it seems like the best like response would have been deterrence, and that's already, the time for that has passed.
Sure.
So now we're just kind of stuck with choosing a bad option amongst other bad options, like choosing the least bad option.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point that you raised about like what kind of precedent would this set? Should the West back off and stop supporting Ukraine? Not only would a lot of people die, right, and assuming that Russia takes Ukraine, but what does that mean? What does that mean around the world? What messages does that send to uh, other powers? That the West isn't gonna. I think that might be the one of the best counters to like isolationist policies. Um, but there's no silver bullet. I mean, those same policies that you might criticize for being isolationist, or if you the other side of that coin and interacting in Eastern Europe and trying to protect Ukraine or whatever, like that same directive has been used and would continue to be used for possibly nefarious ends in other parts of the world.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
like that. I mean, that is at least the cover of why we went into Vietnam and why we went into the Middle East and why we went into various parts of Central and South America. Yeah, we can't allow these things to happen. We have to go protect them. And then I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I like to think that it's not going to come down to some sort of nuclear war. I think the realities that existed throughout the Cold War that kept nuclear arms at bay are still present, even more so. I think Russia knows this. They can't just go nuking people. It's a sort of mutually assured destruction, right? Like it's. Um, so I don't know. It's a very complicated issue. Um, I do think the nuclear issue changes the game in some way, like, and that there is. It sort of makes me think that like there's good reason to keep nuclear arms out of the hands of more countries. Like the countries that have them have them. Um, you can see this with like the Iran nuclear deal and trying to keep countries in the Middle East from developing nuclear arms. But I mean, the flip side of that as well is, well, that's easy. That's easy to say as a United States citizen when your country has nuclear arms, right? Like that's a great deterrent. But if you're some, random country somewhere that is not nuclear armed, like that puts you at greater risk. Like, you don't have that bargaining chip. So, as always, geopolitics is extremely complicated. Um, I am really curious to see what's going to happen with NATO. Should that get expanded? But there's no easy answers to this one. I sort of hope that at some point that Putin or Russia in general just find a way to spin this and say, and end up backing off and finding some way to spin it in their favor anyway, like they accomplish what they were trying to accomplish, but then the end result is them getting out of there anyway. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think it's something to hope for.
I think an interesting idea that is kind of seems relevant is like peace through strength.
Yeah.
So, but and then the other side of it is like just uh, you know increasing arms will just make the other side feel vulnerable, and then they'll increase arms. So it's like an arms race. But
Yeah.
there's something to be said about like having deterrence by having strength, like keeping a strong military or like a functioning country, I guess, for lack of a better term, but being able to deter aggression. Um,
At the international level.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, Yeah, I mean, it goes, and this I could go down another rabbit hole with Ray Dalio and his like principles of what uh, makes a country, like what provides power in a country. Um, but one of the things is like a functioning political system and social system where people get along and it can be unified and like all be their efforts can be directed towards a shared goal.
Hmm.
But yeah, anyway, that's kind of a tangent. Maybe we'll cover that sometime.
Yeah, that's sort of what you see in like in World War II, um, with all the industries sort of mobilizing to support the war effort, and you sort of have in some ways a united front, and we sort of got this post 9/11. At least in our history, that's the time that I feel like the country was most unified, and everyone was sort of willing to put their differences aside and work towards a common goal, and kind of want to preserve whatever social fabric we had. Um, the world feels very different from when it did back then. Um, but yeah, I certainly don't have the answer. I just hope that we can get out of this conflict with you know as minimal bloodshed as possible. But I'm not necessarily sure that that is going to be the case.
Yeah, well, it definitely hasn't been so far, but it's also interesting. Like, I want to say stochastic, like effects where small changes in initial conditions will lead to like larger changes, like much larger changes down the line. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
how uh, you know things like is kind of from like a planning perspective or strategy, like what I don't know if it's choices to act on or what events to respond to versus which ones not to. Um, so like, do
Picking
we
your
stop?
battles.
Yeah, like, do we stop Russia and Ukraine, or do we just let that happen? And you know, maybe that's it, or maybe it just cascades into them trying to take over all of the former USSR, and then it's a Cold War again, or whatever. Or maybe Russia gets extremely weakened and then gets kind of absorbed into some sort of a de facto alliance with China as a like reshuffling of balance of power. Like, so just it's always interesting looking at a system like those small, seemingly small initial changes, how they can develop into like drastically different outcomes.
Hmm. Yeah, the cause and effect of how it all shakes out
Yeah.
is interesting. Yeah, I mean that's always the challenge, right? Is you don't know, like you don't have the you don't have hindsight certainly when you're trying to figure it out for the first time. Um, yeah, it's honestly I don't follow too much of the Russia situation, Russia Ukraine situation too closely right now because it's so depressing. You know,
Yeah.
like
I should probably follow less of it.
um, their president Zelensky is a really interesting guy. He's really become sort of symbol on the international level of like heroism, um, and sort of trying to overcome adversity and standing up to Russia. Obviously, is not an easy task. Did you see the story about the was like there's some small island of Ukrainians, like some military island, and like all these Russian warships came up or something and ordered them to surrender, and they basically
Yeah.
told them to f off, and then they were captured and they're hailed as heroes basically.
Yeah.
There's something interesting about that heroicness of it's almost like a David and Goliath type situation, like
Yeah.
pulling for the underdog, and there's something about wanting them to succeed, um, having that courage and bravery to stand up for yourself. Um, I do think it's interesting the messaging that we hear like from Ukraine about, and then you compare that to like what Russia is saying to justify this war. Like you said, I mean, Ukraine is an autonomous country. They're a sovereign country. They can do what they want, and that's why, like, again, that's why for all the problems that the media has, it's at least interesting that we can hear that. Like, is anybody in Russia hearing what the Ukrainian president is saying about the situation, or are they just getting whatever Russia wants them to hear about the situation? You know?
Yeah, I think they hear very limited outside news, and from from the Reddit subreddits, been browsing through. Their state-run media is very aggressive, to the point of like even saying that nukes should be used and just nuke them all and whatnot, and
Hmm.
they should push through to Poland and like recapture all that territory, and also saying like Ukraine isn't really a separate part of Russia. So there's like a lot of propaganda apparently that is over there, and again, that's just based on what I could see on Reddit,
Yeah.
but um, which would make sense for why uh, something's like 80% approval rating of the war, even though it's not even called a war in Russia, but like 80% of Russians approve of it, but they also have very limited information about it, that they don't even know or believe that their military is bombing non-military targets in Ukraine, which
Right.
seems very obvious based on the reporting that we get. But um, yeah, it just goes to show like the power of the media and like controlling the narrative.
Yeah. What one take that I had heard that seemed rather salient was that Russia is sort of, in a way, still reeling from the effects of World War II. So if you think about the human cost of World War II, the Russian death toll far exceeded. Actually, yeah, I can even pull up the numbers here.
Yeah,
Like
it was in the millions.
oh, it's like so. There's like 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. I want to say that the Russian death toll was over double that. And so there's like a little quip too. Like World War II was won by like I'm probably gonna get it wrong, but like English bravery, like American money, and like Russian blood or something.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, because so many people. Yeah, here I'll share. Let me just swap over to this. World War II casualties. I'm gonna, I don't know if I can. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so
Wow, look at that.
I mean, you're
Like
talking about
24.
almost 24 million between military and civilian deaths. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just astronomical.
China really
Wow, I actually
suffered too.
that's crazy. The China,
It
that's
had to be
mainly
from
civilian.
Japan.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
So and yeah, I mean, look if you look at like and I mean, the United States went through some brutal parts of World War II between the on D-Day and the Normandy beaches, trying to take that area. But on the other front of the war, and there's some great movies about this, like Enemy at the Gates, about the basically the Russian defense of places like Stalingrad and Leningrad, and trying to stall out the Nazi invasion into um, the western part of the Soviet Union. But just absolutely brutal fighting. Um, and so yeah, basically the Soviet Union was I mean, basically they were just throwing bodies at the situation without adequate supplies. Um, Certainly not as well equipped as the other allied forces, but what they had was manpower. And I think so. I read some take on this that in some ways Russia is sort of upset at how I mean the numbers are astronomical, but basically the price that they paid, um, and then obviously the Soviet Union sort of gained power after the war, and then leading up to the Berlin Wall falling and the Soviet Union being broken up. But then as part of that is all those sort of Baltic states you were talking about basically go away. They're not part of Russia, and so there's I think there's some amount of wanting to lay claim to that, like this was our territory, we fought so hard to protect it and defend it. And, World War II does not swing in the Allied favor without that Soviet contribution. Um, to force Hitler to fight a war on two fronts, basically. I mean, it's World War II was so interesting because of that and many other reasons. But I think there is still this pull to try to. It's almost like the Trump slogan, right? Like make Russia great again. Like they want to sort
Yeah.
of recapture that essence of what the Soviet Union was all about. Um, yeah, it's just crazy seeing these numbers in context, to be honest.
Yeah, it's also interesting, like those former Soviet republics, they're some of the strongest uh, supporters of Ukraine right now
Mm,
because they had that shared experience of
yeah,
having lived under Soviet domination for so long and like all the abuses that entailed. So it's it's like a corrupt, harsh totalitarian system, and yeah, like Russia suffered from World War II, like huge deaths, but then this communist system was also killed millions of people
sure.
and created that like economic rot over time that uh, led to the Soviet Union falling. But yeah, I don't know. It just seems like people, if they want to be a part, I guess to a degree, but if they want to be a part of another country, then they should be allowed to apply to join. But if they want to remain independent, they should be able to be independent. And
Yeah.
like in this case, like it seems pretty clear cut that Ukraine should be able to have that autonomy to have their own thing if they want. But the other interesting thing is, uh, I had heard that there's like a chess champion, Gary Kasparov or whatever,
Hmm.
and he describes Russia as basically a fascist dictatorship. Like
Mm,
they have like this quote unquote democracy, and Putin gets reelected or whatever. But um, his take on it is that Russia is already fascist. They're already a dictatorship, like they're a totalitarian state. Um, and I can't remember if he said it, but there's another critique that like they're kind of just like a state. uh, it's like organized crime. It's like a mafia, but like controlling a state. Like that's sort of
mm.
uh, how it's evolved with so much corruption and self dealing and like violence used to enforce. Like there's not really so much a rule of law as there is uh, just raw power being used.
Right.
Um, and then there was another one, Bill Browder. What did he say? There's another. Oh yeah, his take on this whole Ukraine thing is that Putin doesn't even care about the stated objectives. For like taking over territory or denazification or even like countering NATO, but it's more about generating more support, like creating an external enemy and generating more domestic support for him, so he doesn't lose power.
Interesting.
As like
Yeah.
the economy has stagnated in the past 10 years or whatever, 15 years, it's a way like to create a boogeyman basically and
Yeah.
stoke that patriotism.
Yeah, and have the country unite behind him against sort of a common enemy
Yeah.
in a way.
So that's kind of the fascinating thing is like looking at all these different perspectives and trying to figure out what is most likely to be accurate. Is it just like Putin and his like power grab? Is it like maybe NATO was a bit too accommodating for Eastern countries that wanted to join it, and so legitimately was feeling threatening to the Russians, or did Russia just want to take over land that Ukraine had, or is it just this resurgent USSR dream that they're trying to build? So there's a lot of different perspectives for it.
Yeah, and as usual, I mean, geography plays a huge role. It's almost like it's advantageous for Russia to have those Baltic countries on its border between them and Russia or them and Europe who are not in NATO, but who are also not becoming like world powers in a way. Like they almost want some amount of like them to be destabilized in a way, or like keep them poor or something, because it insulates them. It insulates them from major powers on their doorstep. And I mean that gets into the whole NATO thing about if Ukraine joins NATO, then all of a sudden NATO is right on Russia's border.
Yeah. Well, I think they already are, right? Like in those Baltic states, those are part of NATO now, and I believe they share a border with
Are
Russia.
they?
Like, yeah, like pretty sure that they joined NATO, and apparently that was like a big uh, warning. I want to say it was like State Department officials as the Soviet Union fell, like in the early or right after it fell in the early '90s. There was a lot of like thinking saying like you should be very cautious about expanding NATO too far eastward because that's going to make Russia feel threatened.
Yeah, Ukraine is not in NATO.
Right, Ukraine is not. They had been talking about it, like wanting to apply after they threw out the pro-Russian guy in 2014 or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
with the Euromaidan movement.
Right.
But
So
like
Poland is
Latvia,
in
and yeah, I think those guys are.
yeah, Latvia, Lithuania,
And then Poland is, and Poland has a
Poland. Yeah,
border with Russia.
yeah.
But I mean, the whole idea is so part of it is just like a lack of like of trust, right? Like it seems like we have very good reason to be distrustful of Russia because they lie all the time, and now they've attacked, another country, and they've done it in other smaller instances before. But like the whole point of NATO is to be a defensive alliance. So to feel threatened from NATO is that you don't trust them to actually be a defensive alliance.
Interesting. Poland actually doesn't share a border
Oh,
with Russia.
interesting. So it's Belarus. Yeah.
Belarus. But so here's Russia. I mean, Latvia and Lithuania are both in
And
NATO.
yeah, and isn't Estonia in NATO too?
Um, Latvia, Estonia is as
Yeah,
well. Yeah,
Estonia is. Yeah.
Denmark. Yeah. So, but I think those are sort of like smaller players. I mean, if you even just look at the landmass difference,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, regardless of who's in or who's out, I mean, the key point is that Russia wants to try to mitigate the expansion, right? Um, so they might not be happy that Latvia is in part of NATO, but they certainly don't want to see these sort of Baltic countries continue to join. It's like it
Yeah.
would be a different story should Russia have invaded Latvia, is my assumption, is because Latvia is part of NATO. So that means that the
Yeah.
full force
Article
of
five.
NATO,
And,
yeah,
yeah.
Article 5, right? Yeah, I mean, and then Finland, right? So, like, Finland's considering joining NATO. That's obviously that would be a big problem for Russia.
Yeah, and that's kind of the irony of the whole thing is they invaded Ukraine to stop Ukraine, and part of which apparently to stop Ukraine from invading from joining NATO. But now they're going to have another country likely a huge border joining NATO. So,
Yeah,
but
pretty crazy.
yeah, but that is kind of the scary part. Like if they legitimately see NATO as an existential threat, and countries sharing NATO countries sharing a border with them as being an existential threat, that does kind of raise the stakes. Like maybe they would be up for risking nuclear holocaust in order to try to defend themselves from what they see as a threat. But
I mean, it's a really interesting question. Like, what if Russia uses like a first strike nuclear approach in Ukraine, and then the rest of the world watches Ukraine get hit by nuclear arms? Are you going to respond? Like, you can't, like, what are you going to do? Can you respond with nuclear arms? Well, then Russia also, like, you can't go nuke Russia. They'll just nuke you too. And then it's just, you're trying to avoid that end state scenario where everybody gets nuked.
right.
But it's almost like if they nuke first, like, I know we have missile detection programs and things like that. Like, are you going to fire off a nuke as soon as you see them launch one to Ukraine? Like, is it worth? I don't know. There's all
Yeah,
kinds of
that's a
weird
rough calculus.
scenarios. Like how do you how do you determine that?
Yeah, and now there's hypersonic missiles where they can largely evade, or maybe totally evade missile defense systems, and you have like minutes, like a couple of minutes between when that thing is fired and when it hits, even thousands of miles away or whatever. So
Yeah.
that's just like, because that can even potentially affect the calculus in mutually assured destruction. If you can get off a first strike and decapitate command and control in another country, then they can't retaliate. So
Unless they have that decentralized power, if they've been reading up
yeah,
their Jocko.
yeah, yeah, decentralized control. But yeah, I think that's probably a thing that kind of fascinates me about the international stage, is just trying to figure out what's actually going on, versus like the different self-interested narratives and hyperbole or propaganda or whatever. And once trying to figure out likely, scenarios, and also what would be the best course of action for the U.S. or the West in general in this case or whatever.
Yeah.
But definitely not easy to figure out.
I don't envy anyone who has to come up with foreign policy decisions. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's tough. Okay, well, we're getting close to 2 hours here, so anything else you wanted to talk about, or should we wrap it up?
I mean, maybe one last thing to close out is just I think we'll probably have a lot more to build on this theme of like the leadership principles we talked about, Jocko in his book, um, but also like just how they apply in different contexts and sort of across systems more generally, or um, thinking in systems and like the trade-offs that you can make as you organize them differently, or whether you have a more centralized approach or decentralized approach, or yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot more to draw out there. I don't think I have the insights prepared to like articulate them right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're sort of figuring out is that there's a lot of different themes that I think are kind of reoccurring, and we can continue to touch on them here and there, and flesh them out and talk about them. I think stuff like extreme ownership is very relevant and will continue to be relevant in any number of topics that we discuss. I think it has a lot of crossover in a lot of different disciplines. So, yeah, I'll look forward to that. And I mean, I probably need to get my hands on that audiobook one way or another. And
Yeah,
there's a few people. There's a number of people in that space that I am sort of familiar with through interviews or podcasts or whatever, but I haven't necessarily read their published works, for better or for worse. But there's a lot of I think one good takeaway that I have is there's honestly a lot of great, what I might call like modern day intellectuals, people who are posing different ideas and breaking down topics, and accessing that information is easier than ever. The problem more often than not is like discovery, is
Right.
like finding those people. And that doesn't mean that they're going to always be right about everything, but that information is out there. It's it's yours to discover it and consume it should you want to. And you know it's almost just like what we were talking about earlier. Like sometimes it might be hard to get off the couch, right, and try to find those people. So yeah, maybe a good in the future we can talk about maybe who some of those people are. Different people that we like to listen to or read. I'd love to continue to expand the number of different people and podcasts or whatever, books that are on my radar. It's always a good thing to try to find more speakers that resonate with especially some of the themes that we're talking about just life and government and freedoms and meaning. I think these are all great topics that I'm sure will continue to come up.
Yeah, definitely. No shortage of topics.
There never is, which is great. Yeah, that was a great conversation about Ukraine. I think
Yeah.
like many topics, there are no easy answers.
Yeah, I don't think we did it justice, but I don't know if you can do that topic justice unless maybe you're like an expert and have some kind of like privileged access to information or something. But
I think that's why the podcast is called "What Do We Know?" As
yeah,
my knowledge about this situation is very slim. Uh, but anyway, okay. Great discussion as always, and we'll break it here until next time.
sounds good. See
All
ya.
right, bye.